This is lecture 8, where I'll be talking about feminism and romance, and in particular, asking the question whether they go together like champagne and strawberries, or if they are in conflict, i.e. more like oil and water. For too long, sexism has been studied as though it were just another type of ism. It's a big reason why Peter and I wrote your textbook. We complain about that because gender is unique, given that men and women are dependent on one another for love and emotional, sexual, and reproductive gratification. In other words, for things that really matter to most people in life. Yet research on sexism and love, or close relationships research, has been largely conducted in isolation. It's as if these two lines of research have been conducted on parallel tracks, when we thought they should be thought of more as intersecting. So what do I mean by that? Love research has been driven a lot by evolutionary psychologists who look for sex differences in mating strategies, and when they find them, they blame them on biology. But what do we know from lecture 2 is that sex differences in mating preferences vanish in cultures that empower women. So it's not biological in origin. It has more to do with socio-structural factors that oppress women or lift them up. Other love scientists seem to be in love with attachment theory. You maybe learned about this in Intro to Psych. So you'll remember it has a lot to do with this argument that how you love your mate depends on how you were loved by your mother. If she was gave you a secure attachment, then you are more secure in your relationships with other people. If she was avoidant or insecure, then you carried that forward into relationships with other people. Well, one reason why I argue against attachment theory is because of research showing that, in fact, people's attachment style isn't something that develops in childhood and then you're stuck with it the rest of your life. No, it largely depends on the person you've partnered with. If that person has a secure attachment style, then you will be more secure in the relationship, and vice versa. So it's self-reinforcing. But you can be the most secure person in the world, and if you are attracted to an avoidant person, someone who plays hard to get, and then once you develop a relationship with them, they seem to ghost you, right? That's going to influence your attachment style with that person, right? So to my mind, it makes more sense to view how relationships work as it takes two to tango, right? Both people contribute to the security or insecurity of the relationship, and not so much childhood development. So I'm not a fan of either attachment theory or evolutionary psychology, and P.S., they really have nothing to say about sexism. Sexism researchers haven't done a better job, right? For the most part, it's ignored love to focus mainly on traditional gender roles, as we've learned a lot about social role theory, or power differences between men and women to explain, for instance, backlash against female leaders, which has been my approach. But what about our power to attract one another? Isn't that one of the main reasons why gender is a unique social category? Indeed, sex appeal has traditionally been women's principal route to status and prestige. To gain economic power, a woman had to attract the best possible mate. Throughout history, marrying up was the only recourse women had for financial stability. And in fact, they were overtly taught to use their feminine wiles and to be, sweet and charming, and do everything they could in order to attract the best possible man, meaning someone with the best education, who had the best prospects for financial wealth. The women's movement's not just change all that, right? This is a horrible way to have to live your life, and it's been dubbed the most successful revolution of the 1970s. For one thing, it was mainly peaceful, right? Name another revolution that was relatively as bloodless as women's lib. And for another, it brought dramatic changes that appear to be relatively stable, changes not just in attitudes, but in behavior. Also changes to laws, like rape shield laws, and laws about pay equity, and laws about discrimination in the workplace, as we talked about with the sexual harassment lecture, et cetera, right? So when you codify the women's movement in laws, then it becomes a lot harder to take it away, as we're seeing now with Roe v. Wade. Many challenges from many conservative states are trying to completely uproot reproductive rights for women, and so far the Supreme Court has said, no, you can't do that. So this is just a remarkable achievement. It's happened in my lifetime, and if you look around, you would expect women today to be thankful admirers of feminists and eager to join their ranks in order to keep the progress ball rolling, right? Wrong. Young adult men and women are supportive, for the most part, of feminist causes, but they shy away from what Kim and I call the F word, i.e. feminism. They don't identify with feminists, and they don't even like them. Now, just imagine if Black Americans fail to be proud of Martin Luther King Jr. or Rosa Parks. These are icons of the civil rights era from the 1960s and 70s. I would think that people's hair would be on fire. There would be great cause for alarm if Black Americans suddenly were talking trash about icons and pioneers like John Lewis and people like that. Instead, no, they're celebrated, rightly so. So I am alarmed for women, but if you actually think about it, you can hardly blame them, given how feminists have been stigmatized. Negative portrayals of feminists on sexual dimensions, they're ugly, they're man-hating, they're lesbians, in the media turn feminists into social pariahs. Who would want to join that group? They make it seem as though feminism and femininity were at odds, not just feminism and romance. So here's some examples from Googling feminists using Google Images, and we see a lot of anger, we see unattractive women, and we see our old friend Rush Limbaugh, who actually coined the hateful term feminazis. So what does this mean for women's collective power? In interviews, women appreciated what the women's movement had done for them, but they worried it had gone too far and troubled their relationships with men. So if feminism is viewed as in conflict with sex and romance, I guess we would expect a rejection of the F word and even rejecting collective power. In other words, concerns about gender relations, love, sex, and romance might help to explain why young adult women and men distance themselves from feminists. And if that's true, then people who believe feminism is bad for love might be less eager to support feminist causes. In 3 studies, that's exactly what Kim Fairchild and I found. This is an optional paper that's available for you to read on Sakai. Optional because I'll be talking about it in today's lecture, but you can also, if you like, read it for yourself. So in study 1, we borrowed a method first used in 1975. So what we did is we showed Rutgers undergrads photos of women from the 1970s and told them that we knew what had happened to these women, right? We'd, had looked into the future. They were, kids in the 1970s, but we know what they are like today. So we asked them to guess if each woman had become a feminist, if they were heterosexual or a lesbian, and if each woman was popular with men dating-wise during high school. That's our measure of perceived sex appeal. So we were asking the question, does beauty conflict with feminism? And as a result, we had participants judge pretty and plain women on their feminism, sex appeal, and sexuality. So I'm hoping you can tell from the sample stimuli that it goes pretty plain, pretty plain. So what do we find? As in 1975, plain women were more likely to be judged as feminists than pretty women. Nothing has changed in that regard. And that was true of both men and women. So that's your ugly feminist stereotype. And new to this study, plain women were also more likely to be judged as lesbians. So that's your lesbian feminist stereotype. But also as having low sex appeal, meaning they were unpopular with men in high school. Again, the ugly feminist stereotype. More importantly, the ugly feminist stereotype was wholly explained by romance-related attributions or causes for why they guessed a woman had become a feminist. And those were their low sex appeal and their lesbianism. To understand these findings, we're going to take a step back here. I want to teach you something about partial correlations and mediation. When measures correlate, what does that mean? It means that their variance overlaps. So let's just say they overlap as commonly seen in Venn diagrams. Usually you just see a couple of circles overlapping, but what we're concerned with are three variables. So we're concerned with the overlap between variables 1, 2, and 3. So there is this one region where all three of the circles overlap, right? And partial correlation is a procedure that lets us measure that region precisely and then pull it out from the picture in order to determine what the correlation between any of the two variables would be after pulling out their overlap with the third variable. If the correlation becomes small or even functionally zero, non-significant, then we say that the third variable explains or mediates the relationship between the other two variables. So what do I mean by that? For example, there's a positive correlation. It kind of sounds weird on its face, but there's a positive correlation between using birth control and the number of appliances a couple owns. So it doesn't seem like being on the pill would have much to do with your toaster or the fancy refrigerator that you have, right? So something else has to be causing this relationship. Can you guess what it is? It's the couple's income, right? Once you pull that out, then the correlation between using birth control and the number of appliances in the home goes away completely. So it has all to do with the couple's income. Or in other words, the amount of money a couple makes explains why birth control correlates with material possessions. So here's like a generic mediation model where we would have what's the independent variable, or in an experiment, we know what an independent variable is, but if we're talking about regression or correlation, then we call it a predictor variable. But at any rate, we need to see a relationship between the independent variable and the mediator variable, right? So in this case, whether or not the couple uses birth control and their income, right? So couples with a higher income are more likely to use birth control and vice versa, because if you have birth control, then you're not as likely to be burdened with economic demands of having to take care of lots and lots of children. And then that has to correlate, in this case, the socioeconomic status has to correlate with the dependent variable, which is the number of toasters or appliances that you have in the home. And the relationship between birth control and the number of appliances you have in the home, that's positive until you partial out SES. And then once you do that, this drops to non-significance. And I'll show you exactly what that looks like with a different example. So this is an example where people who report that they, where people's math ability, i.e. their score on an SAT math test, correlates with their positively 0.33 with their interest in pursuing math as an academic major. But then that correlation drops to 0.16 once you take out math self-efficacy, i.e. whether somebody feels like they would do well in the math major. So apparently your SAT score is not as predictive of going into math as your primary major as feeling confident in your ability to do well in that major. And of course, all these variables are positively correlated. That's an important thing you need to have for a mediation model. And then I'm pointing out the drop from 0.33 to 0.16 as being like a crucial factor in interpreting your data. Okay, do I have mediation or don't I? Boom, it looks like I do. And then there's some fancy statistical tests that will also help you determine whether that is a significant drop or not. So back to our work. The next slide shows the relationship between women's physical attractiveness as judged by perceivers, and then whether or not people thought that they had become feminists, both before and after accounting for, in this case, the mediator will be their perceived sex appeal. Okay, so attractive women are, of course, so much higher in sex appeal that 0.76 is a huge correlation. They have more sex appeal than plain women, and the higher the sex appeal, the less likely people were to judge these women as having become feminists. Okay, and while attractive women were judged less likely to be feminists, negative 0.36, once we partial out their perceived sex appeal, it drops to absolutely nothing, 0.06. Okay, so that's a successful mediation analysis. And the same thing happens when you take out sex appeal and you put in lesbian as the mediator, right? Attractive women were rated as unlikely to be lesbian, and lesbians were highly suspected to be feminists. And while attractive women were less likely to be feminists, once lesbian was accounted for, that relationship dropped to 0.08, i.e. virtually nothing. So plain women may be viewed as having turned to feminism because they don't have the same economic options pretty women have, namely to rely on men to provide for them financially, either because men shun them for their low sex appeal or because, as lesbians, they are not sexually interested in men themselves. Consequently, as a result of a deeply unsexy feminist stereotype, women may avoid the F label like the plague. Who can blame them? But there's another reason why women may shy away from feminism, as suggested by this New Yorker cartoon. Sex brought us together, but gender drove us apart. So just, you can pause the video and ponder that for a minute and see if you can come up with what it means. What it reminds me of is when I first went back to college in my 30s and I became friendly with another non-traditional student. She was also older and both of us were married. She, at one point, started taking women's studies classes, and she warned me to stay away from them if I wanted to stay married. I was really taken aback. What goes on in those classes to make her think it's somehow dangerous to learn about women's history and the struggle for gender equality? It turned out that her husband was quite sexist, and having realized her marriage was oppressive and he was a chauvinist, she really couldn't stay in it. And so she just assumed that my husband was going to be similarly sexist and chauvinistic, and therefore if I wanted to stay married, I better keep the blinders on, right? I better stay blinkered. But as Naomi Wolf, who's a prominent feminist, wrote a great book called The Beauty Myth, as she puts it, hey, you know what? You're not married to the enemy if he's your friend, if he's not your enemy. So let's all take a deep breath. Nonetheless, many women and men perceive that feminism and romance are in conflict, right? So don't take women's studies courses if you want to be attractive to men. which is likely to decrease the enthusiasm with identifying with the F word and support for feminist causes. So we ran 2 studies that tested this hypothesis. Rutgers undergrads reported their feminist identity, their liking for feminists, and their support for women's civil rights, which included equal pay for equal work, the Equal Rights Amendment, which is a constitutional amendment that still hasn't passed. This is 2020, people, and relief from sexual harassment in the workplace. But first, we asked them whether they thought feminism was in conflict with romance. That's what we used in study 2. Or in study 3, we asked them whether women's financial independence, which is a feminist goal, conflicted with heterosexual harmony, i.e. sexual harmony in the bedroom. So items from the Romantic Conflict Index were feminism and romance do not mix well for women. Feminism can cause women to resent men, which is what I think my friend Linda was trying to warn me about. Feminism can add stress to relationships with men, and most men would probably not want to date a feminist. The Sexual Conflict Index used in study 3 had items like men perform better sexually when they are in charge. If women want to be loved, they should not compete against men in the workplace. If men and women behaved the same, it would take the mystery out of love, and romance depends in part on men being allowed to be in charge. So what did we find? I'm going to show you the results as correlations on the next 2 slides, and I'll show them separately by male and female participants, but in fact, for both genders, results were the same. High scores on the romantic conflict and sexual conflict measures negatively correlated with identifying as a feminist, liking feminists, and support for women's civil rights. So these are women's correlations in both studies. We didn't use feminist identity in study 3. But you can see that it's negative, 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 and this is a reminder of what went into the Civil Rights Index. Men's correlations are really the same. So the perceived conflict between feminism and romance has a depressive effect on feminism, women's collective power, and civil rights advocacy. Striving for equality can be dampened if women and men perceive that it comes at the expense of love and sexual